Welcome. In this presentation, we're going to compare the work culture of higher education to the work culture that you commonly find in industry. After we've done that, we'll talk about how the differences between the two cultures can affect you as you develop your career as a leader in higher education. Some of what we talk about here will be very familiar to you, but some of it may be new information. What I hope will be new is pulling this information together, perhaps in a slightly different way, so that we can reach new conclusions about the challenges inherent in taking on leadership responsibilities in higher education today. We're going to look at the culture of higher education versus the culture of industry, focusing on 4 areas. What's involved in getting ahead? What ordinarily motivates people in these two cultures? The job security, or lack thereof, in the two cultures? And finally, freedom of speech. Does it still exist in higher education? And is it a factor at all in industry? As we look at this analysis of what's necessary to get ahead in higher education, it's important to look at the numbers in parentheses, which represent the percentage of total employees in higher education as of 2012 that these segments represent. What we can see very clearly here is that about a fifth, 21% on average of higher education employees are tenured or tenure track, and they will do very well if they focus above all on publishing and their professional reputation in their field. The extent that student evaluations and service activity will matter will vary from institution to institution and even at times from field to field. But for many institutions, professional reputation and contribution matters more than anything else. Then you have 29% of the employees who teach but are not tenure track. And in most instances, they are in situations where nothing they can do will have any influence over what happens to them. We may find this regrettable, but by now higher education has become highly dependent on its essentially contingent workforce. So what we can see is that faculty makes up about half of all higher education employees. And what the faculty needs to do to get ahead is distinctly different from what it takes to get ahead relative to those performing other functions within the university. By comparison, here's a brief overview of the kinds of things that it takes to quote-unquote get ahead in industry. And they are useful to look at because many, if not all of these same skills, could be decidedly necessary for people holding managerial, professional, or administrative positions in higher education. As you can see, there are no surprises here. But what's critical for many academics to realize is that these skills are as necessary to do a good job of running a college or university as they are to do a good job of running a private sector corporation. And so now let's move on to talking about employee motivation and the differences in culture. What's the difference between a nonprofit organization and a profit-making organization? It's not just bringing money in the door, or not bringing it in. But the fact that most institutions of higher education are nonprofits, either 501c3s or affiliated with one, has a direct effect on their culture. Most people who carve out careers in higher education do so for altruistic reasons. They want to make a difference in the world through education, or they're passionate about a particular field, or they like the culture of academia. Very occasionally, you see people in higher education also where it's just the family business. Arthur Schlesinger, JFK's speechwriter, was an example of that. His father, Arthur Schlesinger Sr., was a professor who revolutionized the way history was taught in the early 20th century, first at Ohio State and subsequently at Harvard. And so then young Arthur Schlesinger followed, teaching first at Harvard himself, and subsequently at the end of his career at the City University of New York after he'd been a major political operative for decades. By comparison, when we look at employee motivation in industry, we see that money matters much, much more. It's worth noting that you can make money these days in higher education. It's well documented that some professors' salaries have broken through the $200,000 barrier, even in fields other than business, medicine, or law. And also worth noting that the salaries of the highest paid university professors have easily toppled the $1 million mark. But for the highly talented, there are many, many more opportunities, as I think we all know, to make much, much more money in industry, whether by starting a company, going to work for a hedge fund or on Wall Street, or working your way up the ladder in a large corporation. One change, though, that does seem to be happening in industry is that in recent years, there's been much more of an emphasis on fit. Does the job that you're being hired to do really fit you and who you are and what you like to do? And then there's this new emphasis on quote-unquote passion. Do you have a passion for what you're doing? But when we look at the big differences between the two cultures, the opportunity or lack of opportunity for major financial rewards is a key distinguishing characteristic. Which brings us then to job security. Looking at cultures in terms of the job security they provide is also a key part of analyzing the two cultures. As I think most of you know, we have an extreme situation in higher education. It's hard for me to imagine any position that is much more secure than a faculty position where the professor has obtained tenure, or situations that are less secure than the situations that many part-time faculty members find themselves. However, in general, we can say that with the exception of the non-tenure track faculty, higher education employment has traditionally tended to be fairly secure. Whereas in industry, employment is far less secure. To begin with, most employment is what lawyers refer to as quote-unquote at will. What this means is that the fine print reads, when a person takes on a new position, he or she can be dismissed without cause at any time. That is, the person is an employee at will, and whenever the will changes, the person may no longer have a job. The other major factor is that publicly owned corporations these days are under constant short-term earnings pressure. Now, what that means is that CEOs often feel that they have to do whatever is necessary to boost earnings on a regular basis. That can mean, for example, doing things like cutting staff when sales are down in order to ensure that the ratio of sales dollars to number of employees stays constant. An example of this would be if a company's revenues, the sales dollars coming in, were to decrease by 10%, top management would feel obliged to lay off 10% of the employees. Honestly, this feels rather heavy-handed to me, but I'm aware of one of the major companies here in Silicon Valley where this has been standard practice for years. The final point, just to mention, is that I'm not aware of anything like tenure that exists in corporate life. So we have big differences between when we look at job security in higher education versus industry. In higher education, with the exception of the non-tenure track faculty, part-time faculty, employment tends to be quite secured, quite stable, whereas in industry, everything is churning and there's far less stability. The final issue that we'll look at then, we've compared the cultures of higher education in terms of what you need to do to get ahead, employee motivation, job security. But the final issue that we'll look at is freedom of speech. Many people consider freedom of speech to be critical to the culture of higher education. The whole reason why we have tenure, so the professors can feel free to say what they want to say without fear of retaliation. And a few of you might actually still remember that the late 1960s and 1970s was an era of strong turmoil in higher education, and many of the issues did revolve around freedom of speech. I'm going to take a minute to read aloud the statement that Kingman Brewster, who was at that time the president of Yale, made when he was talking about why we need freedom of speech and what it does for a university. What he said was, and this was in an article published in 1972 in the Bulletin of the American Association of University Professors, what he said was, "The spirit of academic freedom within the university has a value which goes beyond protecting the individual's broad scope of thought and inquiry. If a university is alive and productive, it is a place where colleagues are in constant dispute, defending their latest intellectual enthusiasm, attacking the contrary views of others. From this trial by combat emerges a sharper insight, later to be blunted by other sharper minds. It is vital that this contest be uninhibited by fear of reprisal." To the best of my knowledge, there really isn't anything like that in industry. Corporate cultures will vary from workplace to workplace about how open you can be about what you think, what you believe, what conclusions you've reached. And the millennials and the internet appear to be having a very positive impact. But no organization that I can think of is as systematically well set up to support freedom of speech as institutions of higher education are. Now, at this point, let's switch gears. We're going to talk about the implications of these comparisons and what they are for all of you as leaders in higher education. Let's start by looking at what we found out in What You Need to Get Ahead. It's really pretty interesting. What we see is that there are really two cultures in higher education. There's the traditional culture of higher education, the academic side, the people who have tenure or who are on the way to getting it, and they're concerned with publication, research grants, students, and they may not have that much interest in governance. Or they're interested in governance, they want to have a voice in what happens, but they may not have an interest in many of the more day-to-day issues of running their institution, those issues that are much more similar to the issues that anyone faces running any kind of business. One of the thoughts that I've really been thinking about while I'm presenting this information, this analysis to you, is I know many of you in the room also are working in community colleges. Community colleges often do not stress research and scholarship on the scale that perhaps universities do. And so we have slight differences in culture, but at the same time, we're still dealing with major differences in the headset of the tenure track faculty and the rest of the institution. When we look at the rest of the institution, the managerial professional side, what we see is that their concerns ultimately bear a much closer concern with the concerns found in industry. What this means is that the challenge for leadership is to ensure that these two cultures coexist well and that they collaborate. In some institutions, this may not be a problem at all, but in others, it may be far more of a challenge. The other issue that's implicit here, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in the last slide, in this presentation. The other issue is that the overall macroeconomics for higher education in this country are not that good. And so we may easily anticipate that many academic institutions will need to go through major change. When times are good, maintaining collegial relations between these two subcultures, the tenured subculture and then the everybody else culture, it may be relatively easy to do. But when our higher education institutions start going through major changes, maintaining good relations between these two groups may become much more difficult. And this truly becomes the challenge for higher education leaders. From the standpoint of someone who's tenured, ultimately the question may be, why do I need to make any changes? From the standpoint of the people who are working, who are on the managerial side, they may see very strong reasons why changes need to be met. And so this becomes the challenge. Now, when we think about employee motivation, the implications for leaders are fairly clear-cut. People working in higher education are not volunteers. They are being paid for their services. But in many instances, they are doing so at a cost. The economists would refer to this as an opportunity cost, quite possibly earning less than they would otherwise in other positions, working in industry or whatever. And so what this means is that to be effective as a leader of in higher education, you need to be very conscious of issues related to morale and maintaining a work environment in the same way that you might if you were managing volunteers. You don't have the financial carrot and stick as much. And the most talented of your folks will often be the ones who have many other far more lucrative alternatives. I'm not sure that this view, the one that I just expressed, is widespread. But especially if we're forecasting an environment where major changes might take place, taking on the challenge of being responsible for the morale of your organization is a good idea. As a footnote to this, in the second module of this course, we'll have a unit on emotional intelligence, which is exactly on the subject that we're talking about now. And finally, the last issue, second to last issue, job security. From many perspectives, the tenure track system is wonderful. It really is the major underpinning that allows quote-unquote freedom of speech. It's the carrot that makes academic teaching jobs highly attractive to many people. The American Association of University Professors strongly makes the case, for example, that tenure is, above all, what makes it possible for higher education to attract quote-unquote the best. But from the standpoint of leadership or management, what tenure means is that for most leaders, they must manage by consensus versus by control. At one point, early in my career, the head of the computer science department at San Jose State was sounding off to me, and he talked about how much he liked working with his administrative staff and the part-time faculty. They're the only people I can tell what to do. Mike had a lot of responsibilities, and at times I assume he could become very tired of having the proverbial responsibility ultimately without the authority to get done what needs to be done and to be perpetually negotiating with his professional peers, his fellow tenured faculty. So, from the standpoint of a leadership career, tenure is a two-edged sword. It ensures a level of collegiality and openness that can be hard to find in other working environments, but it also means that leaders need to develop strong political skills if they want to succeed with their agendas. In a nutshell, and referring to some people we talked about earlier, George S. Patton could not have succeeded as a university president. But Dwight D. Eisenhower was president of Columbia University before he became president of the United States. Patton was a command and control leader, whereas Eisenhower knew that to win the war, he had to develop a consensus among his leaders, and that's the type of leadership skill that folks need in higher education. So, we'll end talking about freedom of speech. Years ago, when I taught freshman composition, I realized that one problem some of the young women especially had in my classroom was that they couldn't write because they didn't believe that they had a right to an opinion. I think of this one student in particular who clearly had been brought up to believe not that just that children were not to be seen and not heard, but that women didn't have much of a right to a voice either. And I had many students like that. So, I saw that my primary job in the classroom was to make all of the students believe that they had a right to be heard and to say what they wanted to say. I told them that what we were doing in the classroom discussions was essentially first draft work. In other words, in our general culture where you sometimes need to be careful about what you say when you finally write your paper, ultimately in their papers they might leave things out. But when they were in the process of figuring out what they really wanted to say, they could do that in my classroom by having that level of freedom. Once they'd said what they had to say, we could turn around and look at it and figure out how to make what they said correct enough for most of their audiences as necessary. And this is a small story, but it's very, very much about the value of freedom of speech. The good news in this story is that my student, by the end of the semester, could say what she wanted to say. And part of how she did it was that I had provided her with a safe environment, the first one she'd probably ever been in, for saying what she wanted first, and then we would edit later. In an era where we're getting more concerned about the kind of training and preparation that higher education provides young people for their careers, it's easy to forget how important the principle of freedom of speech is and should be in higher education. But for many, freedom of speech may very well be what distinguishes our institutions of higher education from the alternatives. Now, before we leave this discussion, we've talked about freedom of speech, we've talked about what you need to get ahead, we've talked about motivation systems, we've talked about job security. There are two elephants in the room that we need to talk about. And the first is the impending retirement of the baby boom generation, which in just the past few years everybody's just begun talking about, and its implications for leaders in higher education. When I was beginning to work on this presentation a few months ago, I was visiting a friend in New Hampshire who'd worked in leadership positions for Ford Motor Company for years. And her comment was that Ford had begun thinking about this challenge 20 years ago and had begun to take steps. The point is, higher education is a bit behind and has a lot of work to do. But the opportunities are particularly great now for people in higher education who can think strategically about how to take on leadership responsibilities. Now, the second elephant in the room is that many people argue right now that the field of higher education is ripe for disruption. What do we mean by this? This is a way of talking that's become especially prevalent among the venture capitalists in Silicon Valley. What it means is that there are many industries where people continued doing business the same way for many, many years, and they started missing out. Easy to talk about how the American automobile industry was very, very ripe for disruption, and indeed that's what's happened. And there are plenty of examples. Now, higher education in this country has been doing very much the same thing in the same way for a long, long time. What opens an industry, a set of companies, a field open? What makes it susceptible to disruption? In this case, what we really see are the underlying model for higher education as we know it right now is not sustainable. It's amazing when you look at the numbers, you see that the price for higher education has increased even more over the past 20 years on an annual basis than medical care. And that means much higher than the rate of inflation. We're dealing with differences like on average 5% versus 2% in an environment where average income on a non-inflation adjusted basis has only been 0.7% per year. And so higher education, our institutions are not in a position where they can pass on increased costs. In turn, can we expect additional funding from government? I don't think so. And so we have essentially a business, if you will, because higher education, in a sense, is a business that will need to change how it does things. And so anyone who can figure out how to deliver more value on a more economic basis may be able to figure out ways in which higher education as we know it gets disrupted. This will be discussed in more detail, actually, in Module 3, in the section talking about trends. The net result of all of this is that employment may very well become less secure in higher education for all but those who are all within the tenure track, assuming the tenure indeed survives. Another key point to this is this will be very difficult for many institutions of higher education because traditionally, as we've seen, they're set up to be very, very stable but very adverse to change. But due to these economic factors, change may be necessary no matter what the resistance level is to it. Now, as I see it, this is where all of you come in as leaders. Now, in our next topic, we'll be talking about applying your vision of yourself to a leader, taking that and looking then at the visions that you can have of the institutions that you're working for.